US President Donald Trump has followed through on his tariff threats.
China, first row. China, 67%.
Breaking news this morning, China is striking back. It is now slapping new retaliatory tariffs on all U.S. goods.
They charge us, we charge them less, so how can anybody be upset?
Just a real example of just how turbulent this is, that it literally, since we've been on air, a massive U-turn from the government.
US tariffs against China add up to 145%.
How far does China have to go? How much more repression? How big a trade deficit? How many jobs have to be lost for the American workers?
We'll see what happens with China. We would love to be able to work a deal.
Thank you very much.
Hello and welcome to Control-Alt-Deceit, a podcast designed to try and dive deep into the threats facing our much-valued Western democracies and ask just how much danger are they in. I'm Nina Dos Santos, former CNN anchor and international broadcaster.
And I'm Owen, Bennett-Jones, formerly a BBC foreign correspondent, now a writer and teacher at New York University and the University of North Carolina.
Well, as a new world order looms and Western democracies continue to face threats, not just from abroad, but also from within as well, we're here to try and get to grips with three things. One, to figure out who is controlling the narrative these days, have a look at which alternative facts they're employing to do that, and also to look further into the future to better understand where all this deception will likely end.
Yep, and this week we're focusing on China. It's very much in the news at the moment, and just trying to understand how China is going about exerting its power globally.
Well, when China was allowed into the World Trade Organization back in 2001, you'll probably remember that a bit clearer than me, Owen, because I wasn't yet a journalist at that time. I was probably still at university, I think. The broad idea from both successive Republican and Democratic governments in the United States and elsewhere around the world was that if this country of more than 1 billion people could become richer, it would have a more vibrant middle class, and that would naturally bring democracy with it. But it didn't, did it?
No, and that's what all the tutors used to teach me. I used to study communist systems at university, and that was what many of these academics thought, many of them from Eastern Europe, actually, and they all thought that the development of a middle class would lead to a demand for democratic power to go along with that economic power that the middle class had. But China has shown us that, it is possible to have a very vibrant, successful economy with an authoritarian system.
Yeah, and one that has lasted more than 2 decades since. I suppose the question now is whether or not China feels that it can try and successfully export that model elsewhere, especially at a time when the United States is retrenching from the international rules-based order that has governed how the West works for so long.
Export the system, but also keep making money at the same time. That's the trick. So to understand that, we've got David Rennie today, senior journalist who's worked in Washington and Beijing, very clued up about all this. And from the UK, Chloe Chung, who is campaigning on human rights issues in the UK relating to China.
Oh, that's all coming up right here on Control-Alt-Deceit. Stay with us.
So, Nina, there's a lot been going on in the last couple of weeks, in relation to China. What have you picked up that we need to be looking at?
Well, obviously, Donald Trump's trade war that he unleashed apparently on everyone around the world before scaling it all back and saying it was only about China has, thrown the US and China economic and geopolitical relationship into sharp focus. I won't go into all the details of what Donald Trump has and hasn't scaled back on in terms of tariffs, because it might all be obsolete by the time this podcast goes to air. But broadly speaking, he wanted to unleash enormous tariffs on Chinese goods, cheap and expensive ones. China reciprocated. We had a full-blown trade war, and then America appeared to step back from the brink and exempt certain goods, like, for instance, iPhones. But I suppose the question I have from here on is, what is this going to mean with regards to Beijing's relationship with other trading partners around the world. Is this going to be Beijing's gain in terms of being able to forge closer relationships with, say, Europe and its big single market of 450 million people? If you were a diplomat in Brussels, you'd be pretty nervous that China might just turn around and fire hose all of its goods that were destined for America but too expensive to send there now and send them all the way over to Europe and dump on your market instead. So that's one consideration going further into the future. And as you said, it has been a busy week, even in the UK with regards to China. We had, one of those emergency sittings of the House of Parliament over the weekend when lawmakers had to pass emergency legislation to wrest control of some of the last blast furnaces to make virgin steel in the UK from a Chinese company that appeared to be hell-bent on shutting them down. So again, we have this tension between the economic prospects and possibilities that China can afford us in the West to fill the vacuum that the United States is leaving. But at the same time, there's still a huge amount of nervousness about Beijing's true ambitions and the way they do business.
That's the way the West looks at it. What is China trying to do? What should our concerns be? I mean, it's quite interesting to look at it as China sees it. So what are they trying to do with British steel? There are some members of Parliament here who say this is deliberate sabotage to undermine the British steel industry so as to strengthen the Chinese steel industry and force more Chinese exports of steel into the British market. There are some very serious politicians who say that's not the case. This is more commercial. And so there's not so much to worry about. And underlying all this is a question about whether Western, let's say, as many people around the world would say, Western arrogance over the last decades during the Cold War has been replaced by Western anxiety and Western lack of self-confidence. And, it is very striking how little we have about what's happening inside the Chinese system politically. And we know everything about Trump and Musk and Navarro and everyone. We don't even know the names of the big politicians in China who may be challenging Xi. What are they discussing? What are they worried about? What are their anxieties? What sort of bodies of thought are there in the system? I mean, it's a real weakness of Western journalism. I mean, I realize it's difficult, but we need to know this stuff now.
Well, it's very difficult because Western journalists can't always get visas to go to China, and they're operating under a very draconian system, one that has been tightened quite significantly under Xi Jinping's term since he came to power. The other thing I'd say is that we don't know some of the big names of the Politburo because a few of them every now and then fall from favor and just arbitrarily disappear. We've had a couple of cases recently of that happening, particularly in the realms of the People's Liberation Army, the army of China, which is, 2 million strong. It's interesting that you're talking about, getting a reading from inside China, because we have been able to do that on this podcast. We've been speaking to David Rennie, who up until recently used to be the Economist magazine's man in Beijing. He's also been the Economist's man in places like Brussels and Washington D.C. as well. So he's uniquely placed to understand these evolving trading relationships and what the Politburo might be focusing on next. This is how we started our conversation, where I asked him essentially to lay out the land as he saw it with regards to the Chinese-US relationship after this trade spat we've had over the last few weeks.
So we've heard so much about what Donald Trump's recent economic policies and the trade war is going to mean for the West and its relationship with China. But how are people viewing it inside China? You've recently been there. Have they been preparing for this moment for quite some time?
Yes, I was back in China a couple of weeks ago. I used to be based in China for many years and I left late last year. So the official message, which has a solid dose of truth to it, but is not the whole story. The official message is that China is well prepared and that it's certainly better prepared than it was in the first Trump administration. That at a simple level, China needs the American market. The American market is important, but it's not nearly as incredibly important as it was last time. That years of decoupling since Donald Trump's first presidency have, just reduced America's importance as a market. They've been focusing on other markets, not just rich markets in Europe, but also around the global south. And they're very keen to stress that point. They've also built an economy that is designed to take pain. So there's been a long-standing effort to make sure that China is not dependent on America or other foreign countries for what the leader Xi Jinping calls chokehold technologies. But in addition to being able to take pain, the Chinese economy has been built to deliver pain. And we've seen this already, that some of the counterattacks that we've seen have been extremely targeted. So China dominates the production, the processing. There's some really important minerals, rare earths that you need for all kinds of modern technologies, batteries, stuff that goes into everything from electric cars to fighter jets. China's absolute lockhold on some of those minerals is already showing its worth because China has banned the export or licensed the export of some of these important minerals. And so China is ready to take pain and China is ready to dish out pain. Does that mean that China is completely uninterested in trying to come to a deal? No, I think China is interested in coming to a deal. And actually, I was just in Washington till a couple of days ago talking to former contacts there and members of the Trump administration, because I used to be the Washington bureau chief before I was the Beijing bureau chief. And what's really interesting is that for all of that kind of fire and fury and that rhetoric about a trade war with China, actually inside the Trump administration, people are also saying, look, we're open to a deal. We're not burning our bridges. And so I think both sides are locked halfway between negotiation and a kind of wrestling match.
So what do you think the strategy here is from Beijing's point of view? How long could it last and what could a trade deal look like?
So you have to kind of go through a list of what is China concerned about and how could China kind of see this working out? What's the best case for China? So, if you start with the worst case, Chinese officials, Chinese scholars, government advisors are absolutely aware of that point that you just made, that, China needs to send its goods somewhere. China is an economy which is not entirely dependent on exports, but it's been an incredibly important source of growth. China is making a big bet on manufacturing at the moment, investing massively in advanced technologies and factories, partly because it had a property sector that had got way too big. And so in the recent years, we've seen an enormous amount of investment going out of pouring concrete, going out of building kind of vast property developments into factories and manufacturing. But if the American market, which is roughly just under 15% of China's export market, if that just goes offline, if there's just a wall of tariffs so high that, the ports are basically at a standstill when it comes to US-China trade, those goods have to go somewhere because millions and millions of Chinese are employed making that stuff. And I think you can certainly see the European Union as, if you like, the last large, rich world market that is still completely open to trade. European officials I've spoken to are absolutely terrified that that tidal wave of, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods just ends up in European markets. But it would not only end up in European markets. And when you're in Beijing, they are acutely conscious that they could end up making themselves enormously unpopular, not just in Europe, but also in Southeast Asia, in some of those markets, in Latin America, in Africa, where until recently, China has been a good news story for many of those trade partners because they were, selling enormous amounts of commodities to China. If China becomes the country that is destroying jobs all over the global south because all of those goods are being diverted from a walled-off American economy to the rest of the world, Chinese scholars, Chinese government advisors are absolutely clear that that's a real challenge for them. The final thing that they're extremely focused on, and I think this was a surprise of my recent trip to China, is they're not actually necessarily panicked by the idea that tariffs will make Chinese goods too expensive for other people to buy. They said that the lesson of the first Trump administration was that actually they were making things that no one could buy anywhere else, and so actually the sales continued. What alarms them more than a price war is the idea that Donald Trump is about to tank the world economy and cause a worldwide recession. That's a real disaster for China because if people don't have money to buy anything, then that matters more than, this or that price change. And so that is actually something they're very focused on in China. So that's the worst case scenario. And then we can talk about what China's best case scenario is. But I think the starting point for the Chinese is, like so many other of America's trade partners, they don't even know exactly what Donald Trump wants. What is Donald Trump's end game? And there, I think China is entirely forgivable because none of its trade partners know what America actually wants right now because the messages coming out of Washington are very often very confused and contradictory.
We're into the second series of this podcast, still trying to figure that one out. we had that big DeepSeek moment over the last few months where obviously China suddenly was propelled to the forefront of the AI Cold War. And it appears as though some of these technologies that China is inventing are actually better than the ones that America is inventing. Will that hold China in good stead, do you think? Or do you think countries will still be very concerned that China is essentially still the CCP, that if they take any investment from a Chinese company, they're essentially doing business with Beijing with all the strings attached?
You put your finger on a real dilemma, certainly for Western countries, countries like the UK, countries in Europe, Australia, those kind of liberal democracies. They've got a real dilemma because you're quite right. China has proved that an autocracy, a dictatorship, which China certainly is perfectly capable of innovating. There used to be, when I first covered China back in the late 1990s, there was this lazy, comfortable idea that the West would always be several steps ahead because there was kind of a democracy premium that as long as your scientists could breathe, freely and think freely, and there was a kind of exchange of ideas, that gave you an innovation premium, and that the Chinese were just kind of tinkerers. They were cheats, they were copiers. They would kind of tinker and make things, more commercial, but they weren't capable of real innovation and invention. That happy talk, I think, is now over. You mentioned the DeepSeek moment, which is clearly a shock in two different ways. So what do we have? We have this seemingly pretty capable large language model, a very important piece of AI innovation. And not only does it appear to be as good as the American models like ChatGPT, but crucially, it turns out that China was capable of producing this model, even though America was absolutely bent on denying China the advanced semiconductors and processors that you need to build that kind of model. And so there's a debate about whether, the Chinese line, the propaganda line, is they did it with an astonishingly small number of chips and at an astonishingly low cost. I have spoken to big tech bosses from rival companies who said, they're lying. Actually, there's a lot of very advanced American chips that was smuggled into China at fairly large cost. But those same rivals will say, but we can't deny that there's very serious innovation that they just demonstrated there. So the Chinese ability to innovate shows that China is a peer competitor, that you don't get a premium just for being a democracy. But it's also demonstrated that the last several years of American policy designed to use America's monopoly in some of the most advanced technologies to kind of choke off the growth of Chinese AI, that strategy basically hasn't worked, that China has escaped that stranglehold and got to the top rank of AI technology. So that is an enormous source of self-confidence in China. If you talk to officials, if you talk to investors, you talk to business leaders, they will all talk about this moment, the DeepSeek moment, as a kind of sign that China has escaped the trap that America was trying to set for it.
Here in the UK, we're facing a situation where Virgin Steel may well have been killed off as a national security asset at a time when the defense industry will need this type of steel soon, because a Chinese company bought the last remnants of big blast furnaces in the UK and essentially tried to snuff them out. Do you think that will put the shivers on investment from Beijing across Europe and the UK and beyond?
Look, Britain has got a bit of a dilemma, or a big dilemma, because, one of the bets on Brexit was that by, being able to forge its own trade policy, being able to write its own investment rules, there was this idea that Britain was going to thrive out of Europe by being uniquely relaxed about investment from foreigners, including China. So there is a clear awareness now that if you are deeply involved with China as an investor or as a trade partner, that comes with the potential for coercion attached. Purely narrowly on the steel thing, the argument I think the Chinese would make is that this is just not a very good company. And Chinese investors, it's not a charity, it's a business deal, it's not a good business, and you can't expect China to keep a steel mill open in the UK that makes no sense. But you're right, there are silly British politicians saying very sincerely that, no, in a world in which, we're back into kind of trench fighting in Ukraine, we've learned that, you may need your own steel in order to make tanks and shells. I think some of that is kind of domestic politics rather than kind of economic rationale. But the final point that I think is a major dilemma for Britain and other countries is that you mentioned China's real success in dominating certain technologies, not just DeepSeek and the AI, but also green tech. Basically, if the British government and other governments in Europe remain serious about going green affordably, getting to net zero on kind of carbon, on greenhouse gas emissions affordably, there's really no way around it which doesn't involve Chinese solar panels, Chinese wind farms, Chinese batteries, Chinese EV makers. There are national security implications to some of these green technologies, to some of these connected vehicles, particularly because the more advanced vehicles, the more advanced technologies, they're all connected to the internet, sending data back to the sort of data center to improve the algorithm for a self-driving car. It turns out to matter tremendously that that data center might be in China and that the Chinese government might be an adversary as well as a trade partner. And so I think that these are all really difficult dilemmas for a country like the UK, but for many Western powers. And I think that that is why for China, that enormous trade war that Donald Trump has picked, which is basically a kind of fairly old-fashioned trade war about jobs and globalization, is not the only challenge that they face right now. You know, yes, that's an enormous kind of blow that they've received from this kind of old heavyweight boxer sitting in Washington, D.C. But at the same time, their entire modern 21st century business model of dominating certain advanced technologies and then selling those around the world, that is also really, really problematic at a time when some of those business deals require quite a deep level of trust. And trust in China is in quite short supply. So I think China is feeling that it can take a lot of pain and can deliver a lot of pain, but it's got a very, very complicated path if it wants to fulfill its strategy of becoming dominant in certain key advanced technologies in the 21st century.
David Rennie there, formerly in Beijing and Washington, and giving us the benefit of experience of both those things. And I mean, one of the things I picked up from it, I don't know what you think, is, he's basically saying that if you look at it from a Chinese point of view again, they don't want to start looking like an adversary, too successful almost. That they don't want to be looking like they're challenging global South economies. They may not care so much about challenging the American economy anymore, but they've got all this issue of how they're perceived around the world. America has pulled out of US aid and so on, fine. But are the Chinese really putting in 50 billion or whatever US aid was to fill that gap, that sort of scale of operation to try and offset some of the economic, as some might see it, exploitation that they will be imposing on the global South?
Well, it's not just sort of unilateral institutions like USAID that, America is retrenching from that'll make a difference on the ground in lots of developing countries. It's also just the heft at big international bodies that has left the room in the United Nations, also in the World Health Organization. Remember, we're just a few years on from a global pandemic that caused a massive economic shock that's still being felt everywhere around the world. And of course, China has been accused of, covering up how that pandemic actually began, but then we now find ourselves with a situation where China is one of the most important countries in big organizations like the World Health Organization, and it also projects huge soft and strong economic power in parts of the developing world. We're seeing China, play a more crucial role alongside global South countries at bodies like the United Nations. And I think this is part of the sort of realignment we're seeing as the United States continues to step back from those institutions under Donald Trump.
Right, so you basically think China can do it, that its soft power will work. I'm not so sure. I mean, it seems to me that when Chinese companies go abroad and do things like close down British Steel, which may have been on a commercial decision, but nonetheless, it will make Britain more suspicious of taking Chinese investment. It will make it politically more difficult. I mean, this was very unpopular in the UK, and China's reputation has just taken down, has gone down a notch or two in the UK. That hurts.
I think you're right, but I think what we're seeing is a mismatch of the timeframes that Xi Jinping and, the Politburo of these grey faces you were talking about before, who we only know a few names that are prominent. I think they have a very different time frame to play with. And obviously what they're counting upon is that successive governments have short memories, particularly when one party is voted in and another party from another side of the political spectrum is voted in thereafter, and they can just blame each other. So, interestingly enough, with regards to British Steel, even just in the last couple of days, there have been members of the same governing Labour Party in the UK saying, well, look, it's not completely excluded that we could find another Chinese investor that isn't this particular Chinese investor in the future. So economics has short memories, particularly in Western democracies, because different parties get voted in and out. Governments that come and go every 5 years have a very different time horizon to, the type of system that you have in China, which is essentially fully fledged autocracy. At the start of this show, we were talking about whether or not democracy would follow trade. When China joined the WTO back in 2001, successive governments from Bill Clinton to George H.W. Bush had campaigned for this. For two reasons. One, because China at that time was the sixth largest economy, and you couldn't really have a World Trade Organization if you were excluding the sixth largest economy. And also because, as George Bush Sr. famously said at the time, I've never seen an example where values and ideas didn't follow goods when eventually they made their way into that type of market. But that hasn't happened. I was looking at some of the statistics on a report on the Council on Foreign Relations the other day about just how much China has benefited from WTO accession. It was the sixth largest economy back in the day, and now it's the second. A huge portion of its population lived in extreme poverty, and that's now down to only 1%. But actually, China's economic boom, especially in terms of manufacturing, has, it's true, taken jobs from other Western economies. It's taken roughly about 2, maybe up to 6 million jobs from the United States, especially in manufacturing and also elsewhere. And now the fact that they're getting so involved in AI should really concern people, because obviously this is the next industrial revolution that'll take more jobs from Western economies. So people better be prepared.
You're listening to Control Alt Deceit, and you're very welcome. And we're going to be moving on in the second half of this podcast to hear a bit about some of the protests that are going on in the UK about Chinese power at home and abroad.
Well, Owen, you covered the WTO accession for the World Service, I believe, back in those days. And one would imagine that so many of the stalling points of the conversation in the run-up to China's eventual accession will have hinged upon human rights. And Beijing hasn't improved on that, right?
If you're a Uyghur, you'd certainly say not. And abroad, and I think the interesting new thing is that there is much more exertion of Chinese power abroad. It's not entirely clear what they're up to. I think there's much more scrutiny of Russia in that area than there is of China. Not sure why, really. And the Chinese have been doing social media campaigns to interfere with elections, not on a partisan basis. The people who follow these things say in all their reporting, it's much more a generalized attempt to undermine confidence in Western democracy rather than to support Labour or Conservative or the Democrats or Republicans. It's a much broader attack. There was this amazing hack on the British Electoral Commission, where they got data on up to 40 million British voters. I've just been looking at that. Why was that important? How can they use that information? Does it matter? Well, yes, it does, because it means they can build profiles of people in the UK. They can build profiles with, linking people's identity to their social media of all the dissidents in the UK. We're going to hear from one of those shortly. And again, it undermines confidence in the system. The fact that the British system can be hacked by the Chinese, and when the Electoral Commission in the UK says, "Oh, there'll be no effect on the integrity of our system," I mean, I don't believe it, and I don't suppose many other people believe it.
But Owen, let me just interject and juxtapose that news of the Electoral Commission hack, which was made public years after it happened. And it was made public on the very same day that, and I wrote a front page piece for the Times about this at the time, that the UK had given a multi-million-pound supercomputer contract to a Chinese provider. So this is the point I'm making, is that, trade with China and, trying to push back against these efforts of transnational repression, you can't divide one from the other. That is essentially the bind that a new UK government that is trying to find growth from wherever it can find it is going to be in. And many other countries around the world as well now, because Donald Trump has given such a shock to the global system. Beijing will be somewhere they will be looking to do more business with, even if they know that it'll come with the usual caveats and conditions that make them very, very queasy.
Example of that, just last week, The Guardian had a story about whether the new rules, the British are introducing rules like they've got in the States, that if you're an agent of a foreign power, if you're working for a foreign power, you have to declare yourself. Well, the States have been doing that for a long time. And if you fall foul of that in the US, you go to court, you get convicted. Now, the British are bringing in something similar, and there are various tiers of how much information people have to give, what categories of people have to declare themselves. And the toughest tier is being reserved for Russia and Iran. China at the moment is not on that toughest tier. Now, is Chinese activity really less, voluminous and less important than Iranian? I mean, I don't think so. The Chinese will be doing more than Iran.
But they haven't been accused of trying to kill people. I think that's the difference, isn't it?
Oh, they have. In Australia, they have. I mean, there are Chinese people who've come over seeking asylum, people who are in the system. I mean, they were seeking asylum, maybe they made it up. But they're saying, no, the Chinese have carried out those sort of killings abroad like Russia has done. There is a real threat. So I don't know. I mean, you're right. It's all about trade. It's all about how far these Western governments feel they can afford to upset China. Let's just hear from one person now who's at the forefront of all that, Chloe Chung, who is campaigning, particularly on democracy in Hong Kong, from London. And she has found, as we'll hear from her now, that the Chinese authorities have put a bounty on her head, seeking her return to Hong Kong, China, so that she can be tried and convicted. I asked her, first of all, why she'd come to the UK in the first place.
In 2019, we started a peaceful protest against a proposed extradition bill that would allow criminal suspects to be sent to mainland China. And China is a place where there is no fair trial at all. So that actually scared people, and therefore millions and millions of Hong Kongers, including young people, old people, family, professionals, we all stand out on the street to protect Hong Kong, our home. And we call for 5 demands, not just withdrawing the bill, but to demand accountability for police violence that happened during the protests, and also a real say in our political system. But then what we got back from the Hong Kong authorities is tear gas, rubber bullets, mass arrest that I have also encountered. And that is also my first time participated in a protest, and it's my first time I experienced and tried tear gas. It was irritating. It was like horrible. And therefore, in 2020, the Hong Kong authorities implemented the national security law, legislation imposed by Beijing in that basically criminalized dissidents and any like pro-democracy activities. And therefore, I feel that it is no longer safe to stay in Hong Kong. I spoke to my family about that. And because the economic in Hong Kong is not going well as well, and therefore we all decided to leave and move to the UK through the BNO visa scheme. Therefore, I am kind of comparatively safer to speak out because I don't have to worry my family back in Hong Kong to get arrested by the authorities. And yeah.
Yeah, just explain that scheme you're talking about. It's a special scheme for Hong Kong, given Britain's historical role there, and it extended basically the right to live in the UK for people like you. So you carried on with your campaigning, and obviously you thought in the UK that would be fine, but it wasn't fine, right? So what happened?
I came to the UK. I did my GCSE here. I did my A-level here. And after that, I decided to take a gap year, and I started to work with the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation. We are an organization who campaign for free Hong Kong political prisoners, campaign for rule of law in Hong Kong, etc. So I started to do advocacy work. I spoke to politicians. I go in and out Parliament. I spoke to journalists about what is actually happening in Hong Kong. As someone who escaped from Hong Kong, I think that I knew more about the truth of what is happening in Hong Kong.
Right, and that led to trouble because in time you discovered there was a bounty on your head. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so last year on Christmas Eve, the Hong Kong authorities placed a 1 million Hong Kong dollar bounty on my head, which is around $128,000 in US dollar, to silence me, try to intimidate me. I was shocked, to be honest, when I knew about this. I received text messages from my friend in Hong Kong and in the UK. They messaged me and said that the Hong Kong authorities were holding press conferences, and they just like announced that they put an arrest warrant and a bounty on my head, and they labeled us as fugitive and said that they would chase us to the ends of the earth and for the rest of our life. And I was really, really shocked because I don't think I have committed a crime. And everything I did was peaceful. It was not, it was just telling the truth.
Have you experienced any physical problems in the UK? I'm talking about surveillance or worse, with people monitoring your activities or even trying to frighten you off doing what you do. Has it gone beyond that bounty announced in Hong Kong?
Well, I don't think I can compare what happened in the UK than what is happening in Hong Kong, because in Hong Kong, it was the authorities and the police that directly intimidate us and trying to silence us. In the UK, it was the long arm of the Chinese Communist Party who tried to silence us. After my bounty, I was actually being followed by two suspicious Chinese men in London. They didn't do anything, they just followed me, they just tried to walk around me and try to listen to the conversation that I'm having with my friend. And I think it like they kind of want me to know that they exist by trying to like scare me and try to tell me that someone is watching you, so be careful. I reported to the police and I haven't heard back from them yet, but the level of threats in the UK is not that simple. It's not just about Chinese agents that's sent by the Chinese authorities. It's also some united fronts, some Chinese patriots that who try to do these all sort of intimidation and like monitor job for the Chinese Communist Party voluntarily. Well, I do believe that they would continue to add people to the bounty list, because by doing that, I think their main goal by doing that is to create a chilling effect between the Hong Kong communities. There were activists that are also on the list whose neighbors got letters telling these neighbors to send him or her to the Chinese embassy, which is ridiculous because it's kind of encouraging people to kidnap us to the embassy.
And China's building a new fortress embassy in the UK. That is a plan that was shelved under previous governments by the local authority for security reasons, but it appears as though they may well go ahead and be allowed to build that embassy with the new government that we have, with this trying to engage in rapprochement with China for economic reasons. You have been at the forefront of those protests because I've seen you with your placards. Are you concerned that the UK government will buckle for economic reasons and people like you could be the victim of that?
Well, I am really, really concerned about the China mega embassy plan, to be honest. I think the UK government is so desperate for economic gains from China. The most concerned bit for me is that the embassy would be 10 times bigger than what they have now. It would provide more resources and more people with diplomatic privilege to work inside the embassy. And the problem is that given that the Labour Party wanted that much economics input from China to the UK, I'm not sure how much they are willing to give up in terms of protecting us. If they are not willing to give up anything for economic reason, even though if we were kidnapped or if anything happened to us, what are they willing to do to protect us? That is my question to the government, and they never actually reply directly. And I also did ask the Home Office, Dan Jarvis, about what is the government plan if I was kidnapped to the embassy, and they just give out templates answer. They did not answer to me directly about my security concern.
Well, Chloe Chung is one of a number of people inside the UK who are Hong Kongers who fled here under the special BNO visa scheme, who are subject to bounties on their heads. There was a whole raft of them, as I made reference to in that question to Chloe, Owen, whose names suddenly appeared upon a list about a year and a half, 2 years ago. And that was met with real furore by British lawmakers, especially under the previous Conservative Party, that had a very vocal anti-China, China hawk backbench lobby. That hawkish lobby isn't quite present as much in the Labour Party. But so people like Chloe, of course, are very concerned that, they may fall off the top of the agenda, but they shouldn't, because obviously there's the real risk that China could have a massive spy hub right at the centre of London if it does go ahead and build this fortress embassy that appeared to have been stymied in terms of the plans a couple of years ago, but now appears to be back on the boil. And you can bet that Beijing will say that is one of the considerations we absolutely want on the table if we're going to do more trade and investment with the UK. It puts the Chancellor of the UK, Rachel Reeves, in a really difficult position because she's promised growth from wherever she can find it. We've had Douglas Alexander, we've had all sorts of government ministers heading to Hong Kong, heading to Beijing over the last few months from our new government in the UK, trying to do what they can to rustle up trade and investment from China. And now this is another option that appears to be a dead end politically for them.
You have this British Steel stuff going on, so tension between London and Beijing, and this embassy issue is there, as we just heard you and Chloe describe. And then suddenly in the British press, there's a raft of stories saying that at the bottom, the plans show there are dungeons planned for the bottom. But of course, the plan doesn't say dungeon, but there are rooms being interpreted now as dungeons. Where did that story come from? I'd be fascinated to know how the papers all got hold of this, who fed that story to them. Certainly, someone is pushing an agenda.
Well, you can imagine that, they spent hundreds of millions of pounds on, the site, on architects' plans to try and get this through. Initially, the original plans, I reported on this extensively for CNN back in the day, were rebuffed by Tower Hamlets, the local borough in London, on the basis that, it would be too difficult to secure a Chinese embassy. But as you said, dungeons underneath the building is really concerning because we had people, Chinese Hong Kongers who live in the UK who are protesting against Beijing, dragged inside the consulate in Manchester a few years ago. And the police had to get in and quickly drag them back off Chinese land because nobody knew what would have happened to them had they been squirreled away into the Chinese diplomatic system. So yes, it's extremely worrying. And also there's other sensitive infrastructure on the site of this new potential Chinese fortress embassy. I've reported on this as well. There are big telecommunication nodes. There's a big BT hub there. There are actually a couple of hundred British citizens who live in apartment blocks that are now on land adjacent to the embassy that is owned by the Communist Party of China. And they feel very uncomfortable about that too. And they're British citizens. They're not even Hong Kongers who are fleeing Beijing.
Just finally, maybe to emphasize the point you made about the two-party system being a problem with this. I read an account of this Chinese issue where they've been trying with the Conservatives, China, to get this thing through and getting blocked. And then a new government comes in, and the first thing this article claimed, which sounded very plausible to me, that the Chinese do is they go to the new government and say, look, before we talk about anything else, we just want to say, can you get this embassy thing through? It's very important to us, and then we can talk about trade later. And that puts massive pressure on Starmer, the British Prime Minister, to do that. It seems like a very minor concession. They want an embassy. But we just heard from Chloe Chung how important that could be to China and to people like her. So it is this weakness. I mean, obviously, this is all about the strength of liberal democracy, but the multi-party system and the change of governments is a weakness in strategic negotiations and policy compared to governments that can stay in place for 20, 30, 40, 50 years.
Absolutely. And then I suppose the last thing to mention is these overseas Chinese police stations. The idea that China could have all these sort of extra territorial levers that it can pull among the Chinese diaspora community. That's one of the things she was referring to. And, there were reports just a few years ago that there were more than 100, maybe multiples of that number of Chinese unofficial spy stations set up to spy on Chinese citizens elsewhere around the world. Essentially, the logic here is that Xi Jinping appears to believe that anybody who is of Chinese heritage, origin, even if they weren't even born in China, should show, patriotism towards a system that is essentially autocratic. And that's one of the points that Chloe is making there, isn't she? She's saying, I now live in a democracy, but China believes that just by virtue of me being Chinese originally born, I should be, show loyalty to an autocratic system. It creates a real wedge in some Western societies.
I think that's absolutely right. The main Chinese effort to date has been against Chinese citizens abroad. And when that expands into Western citizens, presumably that will come. That'll be the next phase. Anyway, been great to talk to you. And that's it for this edition of Control Alt Deceit.
Yes, this edition of Control Alt Deceit was produced by Piers Lynch, and it was presented in association with Democratis, which is a charity that is set up to educate all of us about our democratic institutions and how valuable they are. I'm Nina Dos Santos.
And I'm Owen Bennett-Jones.
If you want to stay up to date with any of our future episodes, you can follow us on all sorts of social media handles, including on X, where our handle is at CTRL_danger. You can find us on Blue Sky, on LinkedIn, and we also have a YouTube channel. And we're now a second episode into our second series, and our third episode is coming from a place where you actually teach, Owen. Tell us all about it.
It's New York University, their campus in London, an amazing new building. We'll have some of the students there, and the topic is this growing divide, apparently, which the polls have revealed between young women moving left and young men moving right. Why is that happening? What explains it? We'll have experts on that and the views of these highly engaged, intelligent students. So that's next week. But for this week, thanks for listening. And from Owen Bennett-Jones and
Nina Dos Santos.
It's goodbye. It's goodbye.